Hey everybody, this time we're going to be finishing up on World War One and looking at the Soviet Revolution that was kind of happening at the same time as the end of World War One and then progresses after. Then we'll look at the sort of rest of the world during World War One, how it affected people sort of in the colonies or around the globe, what they made of the United States and Lenin and other groups during this time, sort of with an eye towards the future. So by 1919, the war is going to end, and everybody just wants peace. It had sort of been dragging on for a long time. In many ways, the war starts to fall apart by 1917, and it just seemed like nobody was going to win in particular, and it was just sort of this long-lasting thing. The Allies gain more and more traction and more sort of advantages until it's clear the Central Powers can't win. At the same time, something weird is going on with the Soviet Union. They're going to leave the Allies, they're going to just go do their own thing. So we'll get into that and how that all works out. First, we'll look at the ending of the war, what actually took place, and how that came about. Then we'll talk about the Soviet Revolution. Then we'll talk about this weird moment where the ideas from President Woodrow Wilson in the US and from Lenin are sort of percolating in the minds of intellectuals and elites in Africa, in Southeast Asia, in East Asia, kind of all around the world, um, and what those people were thinking the future was going to be like, and how that might lead towards some other sort of conflicts or ideas in the 1920s and 30s. So the war to end all wars, as it was called, eventually, right? It was not World War II yet, right? Because I haven't got there. Um, Came to an end pretty abruptly after a really long time of this sort of stalemate combat. Remember, on the Western Front, the European forces are kind of duking it out just for a long time in this sort of trench warfare. And this very ugly, horrific experience, right? We watched that video about it, and it's so long that everyone's just exhausted. And when the war ends, it just kind of falls apart pretty quickly. So, two really big events that are going to play into this are the United States entering the war and Russia leaving the war. And those aren't the determining factors, they aren't the only thing that's important. But when those two events happen, it really shifts the power towards the Allies, away from the Eastern Front, and towards a settlement in Europe. So how did the fronts collapse? How did it actually start to come to pass that the war was over? Well, you start to see as early as 1916 these rebellions, these cases of unrest or mutinies where it's very clear that civilians and soldiers around Europe have had too much. The war's been going on too long. There haven't been successes. Remember, everyone had that idea that war was going to be really quick and really easy and like filled with glory and stuff like that from their imperial victories they'd been having over the last, 50 years, 100 years. And when that didn't work out, people get disheartened, they get disillusioned. There's all kinds of problems that come along with war, right? We talked about rationing or different forms of propaganda. So people were just exhausted. So you see, like in 1916, Ireland, there's a rebellion that happens on Easter, right, against the United Kingdom. Or in early 1917, there's a famous incident where a bunch of German sailors rebel. They essentially refuse to get on the boats. That same year, 50,000 troops, French troops, mutiny. They're sent up to the front lines. Remember, there was that like no man's land and the trenches on both sides. They're sent to go to the trenches and they just refuse. So when things like this start happening, you can't keep going with the war. It's kind of grinding to a halt. At the same time, there's food shortages all over Europe and to a lesser extent to their colonies. There's shortage of oil, supplies, commercial products, everything, right? So there's this growing political pressure to end the war. just to stop the bleeding, to kind of get out. And even though everybody wants to win, winning becomes less directly important as sort of surviving the war. On top of all of that, in early 1918, you get a global pandemic that I'm sure some of you have heard kind of about a little bit recently, that sweeps the globe and really actually kills quite a bit more people than the war. It pops up everywhere. It probably originated in the United States. It's really hard to know. Some of the earliest cases were in the Midwest around the auto factories, but Americans call it the Spanish flu because it's always more convenient to sort of say somebody else developed it or whatever. Anywho, so before long, it's in the Pacific Ocean, it's in Europe, it's in South Asia, it's everywhere. And the death tolls from it are really appalling. Within about a year and a half, by the end of the sort of second wave of it, more than 20 million people have died. And unlike other flu viruses, the majority of people that are dying are otherwise pretty healthy individuals in their mid-20s or late 20s. So normally when you think of the flu and you think of who dies from it, you think of older folks, people in their 70s, 80s, 90s, or perhaps kids, right? So it can be very dangerous for infants, for example. But in the case of the Spanish flu or this sort of influenza pandemic, a lot of people that were dying were groups that normally didn't. And this is a little bit hard to understand how this works, but the flu was so virulent that people's immune systems couldn't do very well to fight it off. So just like with HIV, it's not the flu that kills you. It's your body's reaction to it that kills you. In the case of HIV, right, HIV doesn't actually kill anybody. AIDS doesn't actually kill anybody. What it does is it lowers your immune system so much that any other little teeny thing can kill you very easily. In the case of the influenza, what happened was the people's bodies tried to kill off the virus, but it couldn't. So it kept cranking everything out. So people's bodies would heat up, they would bleed, they would do all kinds of other things that our immune systems try to do to combat the virus, and it just didn't work. So our immune system just like kept dialing it up. And so if you were kind of young and healthy and strong, you had a really strong immune system, those limits could keep pushing. But if your fever gets too high for too long, for example, you literally just cook your organs, you cook your brain. So people were dying from that. Also, a lot of army doctors did autopsies on these patients, and they found that when they look at the lungs of these otherwise healthy young folks, the lungs would be really heavy and they would kind of just crumble apart, like overcooked liver or something, like they had been kind of cooked from the inside. And it was just the people's bodies were producing too much heat to try to kill off the virus. So actually, older folks did a little bit better because their immune systems were weaker. So they suffered from the virus, but they weren't able to produce such a reaction that could kill them, right? So pretty horrible stuff. In some places, like on certain Pacific islands, maybe 40% of the population dies. It's a really horrible sort of virus, and is definitely one of the reasons for ending the war. When something like this is going on, it's hard enough already to field armies when they don't want to fight. When you mix in something like this, it becomes almost impossible, and people just want to kind of get on to normal life. They want to end these other problems. So what did the actual settlement look like? How did peace come about? It's actually a really long process. So the first sort of peace settlement conferences start in January 1918. The war is still kind of going on. In theory, this was an international effort. There were 27 nations represented at this table. All of them theoretically had some sort of say in how the war was going to end or what was going to happen. Remember, this is a global war, it's an international war. But really, Britain, France, and the US dominate all the outcomes and really get what they want, primarily Britain and France. And the way they set it up is that they're going to remain the main powers in Europe after World War One. They're not giving up anything. They're not asking, well, what caused the conflict and how can we avoid something like this necessarily. They're really looking to preserve their own interests and to sort of develop a newer world order where they lead from Europe, right? Um, at this peace conference, some weird things happen that might set the stage for the 20s and 30s, or maybe even World War II. For example, the Central Powers aren't allowed to have their own representatives at the conference. So whenever you're trying to make peace, ostensibly you think of both sides kind of coming together and coming to an agreement. But as the Allied powers were pretty much at this point guaranteed victory, and it had been this long grind and nobody really wanted to continue, they didn't have to do that. They didn't have to offer the Central Powers anything. And so the Central Powers are not representative. This could be really problematic. Think about like, say there's like some little scuffle in a high school, right? Something really low stakes or something. And you bring both the kids into the principal's office or something, but only one gets to talk with the principal, and then they decide how the other kid's going to be punished, right? In that case, you're like, whoa, that sounds really horribly unfair. Where imagine that at like the scale of nations and war and stuff. So it's incredibly sort of lopsided. Also, the Soviet Union wasn't present at the conference. They weren't invited. And we'll get to why in a minute, but that's a really big problem because they did a ton of the fighting on the Eastern Front. They did a ton of the dying for the war, and they really were there at the start. So it's interesting that they weren't there. We'll kind of get to why in just a minute. They have their own sort of separate thing. Part of this whole conference revolved around Woodrow Wilson, in particular his 14 points. And Woodrow Wilson saw himself, he was excited about internationalism, and he really did think this was the last sort of large war there would be, and that the lessons from this war, all of the massive destruction, had signaled to human beings that it was sort of time to move on. And he had this 14-point plan for what the future would look like after the war. And the key point that most people kind of attached to was this idea of self-determination, that every nation had the right to rule itself, to be a sovereign state, that every ethnic group could manage their own destiny and have their own nation state. But Woodrow Wilson was talking about Europeans only. Even though this was used in propaganda in Asia and Africa, the idea of self-determination that Woodrow Wilson was talking about was only for Europeans. Wilson, remember, if we haven't brought this up already, was a deeply racist kind of guy, and he did not think that non-Europeans had the capacity to rule themselves. He famously played a film at the White House about how great the Ku Klux Klan was, right? One of the first movies ever made, and so on. But the idea remained, and it was very popular, and it's the sort of thing that once you put out there, you can't control it. So even though in his mind he was talking about self-determination, oh, but only for Europe, everybody heard it, and it's sort of one of those things you can't put the genie back in the bottle. Other people were talking about it in India and China and other places. In the end, most people are going to feel like this conference doesn't pan out. It doesn't really give them what they wanted or what they thought should happen at the end of the war, in large part because the treaties were seen or came to be seen as sort of wrong-headed or moving in the wrong direction. So what kind of treaties came out of this conference? Well, there's two major ones. The Treaty of Versailles in 1919, which many of you may have already heard about from history classes you did in high school or something like this. It's very commonly talked about. Another one that came out kind of a little bit later from this sort of peace endeavor was the Treaty of Sèvres in 1920. So the Treaty of Versailles was really heavily punitive towards Germany. So why just Germany? Well, the Austrian Empire, the Austria-Hungary is going to dissolve. So you can't really punish them anyway. The Ottoman Empire is going to dissolve in 1920 with that next treaty, so you can't necessarily punish them as directly. But Germany is going to remain a state. So what does this treaty do? Well, it says the German military can only be this big, their industrial capacity can only be this big, they're not allowed to have an air force, they're not allowed to conduct their own foreign policy. They owe a ton of reparations to the war. So here's this cartoon's about it, right? 55 billion in reparations. So what this means is basically Britain and France gave a bill to Germany for an incredible amount to sort of pay them back for the damages caused by the war. But this is pretty problematic. Ideally, what were they trying to do with these reparations? Well, they were trying to keep Germany weak. And so if you give them this really big bill, then they have to repay it. They can't spend that money to industrialize, to invest in Germany, to rebuild the military and stuff like that. But the problem is, if you are too punitive, then the state might not function very well, and they might not be able to pay this stuff back anyway. Also, I didn't put it in the list here, but Germany has to cede some territory to Poland. That's going to be important kind of later. And this really angers a lot of Germans who didn't particularly start the war, and they didn't feel like they were defeated either. Remember, the Allies are not going to win by actually invading Germany and taking over and stuff like that. In the end, it's a negotiated peace. And so a lot of Germans are going to come to believe that this treaty was too harsh and was unfair. But actually, this is what a lot of treaties were like at the time. A lot of treaties at the time came with reparations and loss of territory, so it wasn't really unusual. It becomes seen as unusual later on. And a lot of people point to this treaty as the reason for World War II, but that's kind of becomes the story after World War II. So we'll kind of see that later a little bit. The Treaty of Sèvres basically just dissolves the Ottoman Empire, and that was its main sort of goal, right? They were the other major force for the Central Powers. And when that happens, Mustafa Kemal, or Ataturk, right, as he's called, is going to essentially rebel against the new sort of fledgling state, this dissolved Ottoman Empire. The Sultanate gets abolished, and he's going to proclaim a new state, the Republic of Turkey. So this is when Turkey gets founded as its own sort of political entity. But that means that all of those other Ottoman territories in North Africa, in Southwest Asia, even up bordering near Russia and stuff, those are all going to go away. Those are going to go somewhere else. So these treaties really shake up the way Europe looks and the sort of power structures in Europe. At the same time, another one of Woodrow Wilson's ideas was that instead of fighting another major war, there should be some sort of international political body where representatives from every nation can come together and discuss their grievances and solve problems. And he calls this the League of Nations. And this is created in the wake of World War I. So from 1920 to 1946, there's the League of Nations, and it's sort of like the forerunner to the United Nations. It's the same idea. Instead of state, A getting mad at state B and then them attacking each other, the theory goes, well, they can meet in this sort of neutral space, surrounded by their peers, and discuss the problems they're having, come to a working conclusion, a sort of political solution instead of war. And that through this you could maintain world peace, which became sort of an idea, right? If you can have world wars, you can have world peace as well. So surprisingly, it was not just a bunch of Europeans or white folks. It was actually lots of other nations: Thailand, Japan, Ethiopia, the new Republic of China, Chile, all kinds of representatives eventually were there, the Soviet Union. But it did have some problems. And the first major problem was the United States wasn't a member. Now that might sound kind of weird since it was Woodrow Wilson's idea and it's coming from the US president. But in the end, right before the League is founded, The Congress in the United States says no way. They didn't want to get drawn into this other sort of international European body. They had spent a lot of time and money already fighting in Europe, and a lot of congressmen, right, there's no women yet, were trying to um, come out of the war looking like, okay, we've had a victory and now we're done doing that stuff. And they didn't want to create these attachments and make it look like they were still going to be spending money abroad and stuff like that. So the US was going to become one of the biggest political and economic powers, but if they're not part of the League of Nations, that's a problem. Also, the League of Nations had no enforcement structure. So they could hold committees, they could have talks, they could file reports, they could expose problems and stuff like this. But when push came to shove, they had no ability to change the situation on the ground. They couldn't enforce anything. So, for example, the United Nations has troops, they have sanction power, they have medical support, they can send all these sorts of things. And the League of Nations just didn't really have any of that to hold on to or sort of enforce their actions. It is the precedent for the United Nations, which is going to become helpful in the future and is going to become more sort of impactful on global peace and economic, education movements, things like this. But at the time, it just wasn't set up. It is sort of a model that we're going to see in the future for those things, but it didn't really work so smoothly, and we'll see some problems with it leading into World War II in particular. So when the Ottoman Empire was broken up, another thing that happens that's really strange, that's going to set a sort of precedent for the future coming too, is the mandate system. So here on this map you see the independent Republic of Turkey because the Ottoman Empire has dissolved. So what do you do with all of those areas that were formerly part of the Ottoman Empire, either colonies or subjects or sort of protectorates or whatever? How do you divide those amongst the victors? Because remember, it was really common for, at this time, for a losing nation to lose territory, right? Like Germany loses territory in East Prussia and stuff like that. So what should be done? Well, the idea was, instead of just the British and the French and the Americans just like swooping up all these colonies, that idea of self-determination was strong enough and being promoted in Europe that they said, well, we won't have colonies. We're going to have trusteeships. They look and smell exactly like a colony or whatever, but hey, man, we'll call them trusteeships. They'll be a little bit better. So you can see there's like the French Mandate of Syria or the British Mandate of Mesopotamia, which became Iraq, or the British Mandate of Palestine, which is going to become, Israel and Palestine and Jordan and stuff. So here's one sort of official for the mandate system talking about why it's necessary, and he says, these places were inhabited by people not yet able to stand by themselves under the strenuous conditions of the modern world. The tutelage of such people should be entrusted to the advanced nations who can best undertake the responsibility. It sounds like imperialism and colonization, man. I mean, they couldn't quite call it that because they needed to call it something different. There's this idea of self-determination, and these people had just broken away from the Ottoman Empire right through the war. It might not surprise you to learn that these areas also had a bunch of resources. There's one resource in particular that was becoming essential to economies and war efforts. It turns out these places have a lot of oil, and the British and French are going to want that oil. So these trusteeships that ostensibly are to like help these people learn to govern themselves or something, which again is always an excuse for imperialism, also just happen to have a resource that the British and French really want and don't have at home. So we're going to see that's going to be kind of a problem. So that's some of the fallout from World War I and the way it sort of shakes down. But you'll notice we didn't really talk about Russia very much or the Soviet Union. I was just going to put that in its own sort of section here because it's running in parallel to World War I, but it has its own sort of trajectory. So all of the sort of problems from the war that we talked about, rebellions, mutinies, food shortages, that's all going on in Russia too. And it's going to cause this massive Russian empire to fall apart, or maybe just change its character. So one of the first things that happens is this February Revolution. So actually it takes place in March 1917, but the calendar system was a little bit different. So it's called the February Revolution. So in Russia, they're having all the same problems the rest of Europe is: food shortages, there's riots, mutinies, popular demonstrations. People don't want to be part of the war. The war's been going on for years. So finally, it's pushing on the government so much that the Tsarist um, government can't cope. And Tsar Nicholas II just says, "That's it, I quit." So he steps down. He says, "Look, if you people want it so bad, you deal with it." But when he does that, there's no replacement plan in effect. There's no backup government. So pretty quickly, this is a big problem. The government doesn't really shut down because there's a whole structure in place, right, from the Russian government that was there. It kind of limps along. I think it's called the provisional government. But the monarchy is not in charge anymore. The monarchy they're taking their ball, they're going home, right? At the same time, when this is happening, there's a growing sort of communist movements and various socialist movements and green movements and anarchy movements and all kinds of stuff in Russia. There's all kinds of other political things out there. But one is really growing in sort of strength and size, the Petrograd Soviet. And this is kind of like a communist political organization. So when the provisional government comes to power, they don't want to make any changes. They're worried about winning the war. They're worried about continuing the policies of the monarchy, keeping the Russian population in line. So they think, well, we got to just kind of keep this train running for a little bit until we can cobble together a new government and a new situation moving forward. But the Petrograd Soviet says, no way, man. The revolution's happened. We've been waiting for this. We've been trying to get rid of the monarchy for a long time. Now the monarchy's gone. So we want a share of the pie. We want to try to put in place all of these government policies that we've been fighting for the Russian people for a long time. Well, it's gonna slowly work, but it takes a few months. And during that time, after the first revolution, something weird is going to happen. Um, there's this guy, Vladimir Lenin, who is a philosopher, a writer. He's a politician, and he basically had to flee Russia earlier in his life, and he had been living in Germany, sort of broadly speaking. So when the revolution kicks off in Russia, the Germans have a plan. They're going to sneak Lenin back into Russia as a sort of political operative and hope that he can keep things stirred up there, maybe cause some trouble or something, and keep Russia kind of maybe out of the war or mess them up in some way. Lenin was a communist. In particular, he was concerned about the proletariat working class, and he argued that instead of just like a spontaneous thing like Marx maybe had talked about, that the proletariat working class needed some sort of leadership, a sort of vanguard elite that could have the right ideology, have the right knowledge to help people on this track towards socialism and communism. So when he gets to Russia, he's going to become the leader of the Bolshevik party over time. So the Bolsheviks were not the main communist group. They were like a subsect. The Mensheviks were the main communist group. So they were like one subsect of the sort of communist groups, and they break away from the main organization. Their ideas are like a little radical. And Lenin starts to lead his own sort of political and military movement, with the idea being that the monarchy has left and the provisional government is not valid, and that what the people really need is leadership designed to do the best for the people. His whole platform is, look, we got to immediately end this war, and it boils down to three words for him, right? People need peace, land, and bread. So we want to get out of the war. We want to make sure people have land to live on or to farm, and we want to make sure people have enough to eat. And none of that was true right at the time. There's a war. The people can't pay their rent. Agricultural land that's caught in the conflict is in big trouble. People are starving. So this really appealed to people. It has a really simple political message. Here's what we're doing. 1, 2, 3. And Lenin and the Bolsheviks, their popularity really grows around this message. And this leads to another revolution. It's called the October Revolution, but actually it happened in early November in 1917. The Soviets, right, these Bolsheviks, are going to invade the Winter Palace where the provisional Russian government has set up, right? It used to be where the Tsars lived, and they're going to replace them. So now you have a new government that's run by the Soviets starting in 1917, with Lenin as the sort of main political voice or main political actor, not necessarily in charge of yet, but moving in that direction for this new government composed of Soviets who want to end the war and create a sort of communist state in Russia. Well, it kind of worked. When the new Soviet government comes into power, they do make good on some of their political platform. The first being just to get out of the war. So the Russians hastily put together a treaty with Germany, the Soviet Russians, and in March 1918 they sign the Treaty of Brest-Litov, and it basically is just like, get me out of here as quick as possible. The Russians give up everything. They give up a huge amount of territory, and the treaty is phrased in this really derogatory, humiliating terms about how gross and horrible the Russians are and how great the Germans are and stuff like that. But the Soviet leadership, they just don't care. They just say, look, we just want out of the war right now. So in this little map over here, you can see this little red line here. Let me, yeah, you see this like red line right here, right? That's where the kind of front for the war actually was at the time this happens, and where most of the fighting had been sort of on the east. But all of those areas in blue, the darker blue, are going to get ceded by the Soviet Union. They're just going to say, okay, fine, take them. We give that up in exchange for just kind of ending the war immediately. So a huge chunk of its territory in Europe and a quarter of its population is ceded in these treaties. But it's just a way for the Soviet Union to immediately get out of the war. When the war ends, of course, and Germany loses, all of these are going to get reshuffled anyway, and this is going to become like the Soviet Union's portion of Ukraine, and it's going to become Poland and Czechoslovakia and other stuff like this too. And so this is all going to change anyway. But at the time, the Soviets were just like, pull the plug and get out of there. So this is why they don't get invited to the Paris Peace Conference, because they had already sort of settled with Germany. Also, the Soviet Revolution is like deeply unsettling for other Europeans. Remember, they still have a monarchy, and Britain and Americans are anti-communist and stuff, so it had already been sort of scary for them, so they didn't really want them at the peace conference. Well, that doesn't mean that everything was settled with the Soviet Union. So the Soviet Union was able to immediately get out of the war, They were immediately able to sort of begin land uh, reallocation and stuff like this. But there was a lot of resistance. Not everyone wanted to be communists. Not everyone wanted to be part of this new Soviet experiment. So the minute the Soviets come into power, it's another civil war just starts kind of immediately within Russia. So you have a civil war that's sort of three-sided. You have reds, you have whites, and you have greens. This is what's kind of weird. When you hear about white Russians, it has nothing to do with race or ethnicity or skin color or anything like that. People often, I don't know, for some reason think that. Anyway, the Reds were the Soviet army, led by the Bolsheviks. So this was Lenin and crew, right? The whites were people who supported the monarchy, or people who had been part of that provisional government, or socialists who weren't excited about Lenin or the type of communism that he was putting out there. Then the third group are these Greens, and they're kind of the hardest to describe. These were peasant organizations, peasant groups. Remember, the serfs had been freed not that long ago, and there were some sort of political parties, populist parties among peasants. They're anarchists who don't want this sort of form of Soviet or communist government that's coming around. There were also a lot of non-aligned folks that were either political or military folks who didn't want either the red or the whites. They wanted something else. So there's all kinds of opposing powers that are going to kind of duke it out for about 5 years in Russia, even as the Soviet government is developing and claiming it already has victory and is the leader of this new state. There's all kinds of conflict within the state still over the next 5 years. So it's really complicated, but at least that's like kind of an introduction for you to get a sense of what's going on there. So outside of Europe, all of these settlements and the Soviet Revolution have a huge impact. For a few years, the ideas that are put out there by Wilson and Lenin really inspire a whole sort of generation of intellectuals and philosophers and politicians about the possibility that the future holds for them. They're moved by the ideas promoted by Wilson and by Lenin, but there's also other things going on too. So Wilson and Lenin basically are calling for a new sort of global politic, a new sort of way of international relations that colonial peoples are really moved by, because both Wilson and Lenin seem to be arguing at some level that colonialism is bad and the imperial system needs to change, at least as led by Europe. But even though a lot of people outside of Europe and the United States are really excited about these ideas, they're not going to come true for them right away. So what did Wilsonianism look like? Why was this exciting people in China, in Africa, and Southeast Asia? Well, it was a big part of US propaganda during the war, this idea of self-determination. Remember, the war had started because the Austrian Empire was having some trouble in its sort of European colonies. And Wilson was saying everyone should be able to have self-determination, even if they're part of a colonial situation or whatever. But he was really only talking about white folks, right? He was talking about like the Serbians. If the Serbians want to have their own state, they should have it. If in the Balkans, they should be able to divide any way they want. The Croats and the Czechs and the Slovenians or whatever, right? Everyone should have their own state if they want it, but European. However, people in the colonies heard this message and they thought, yeah, that's a great idea, self-determination. The Vietnamese people should have self-determination. Yeah, we're our own sort of nation. We should have our own state. This makes sense. So a lot of people in Egypt and India and China and Vietnam and Indonesia and stuff, they're writing about Wilson. They're like really excited about this idea. And they see America as this great example of anti-colonialism, anti-imperialism. Remember, America was a British colony, and there was a revolution, and people fought the British and eventually became something else. So people in British colonies all over the world were hearing this message from Wilson about self-determination, and America's this example of like a colony that broke away. And it's really like a sort of shining star for what anti-imperialism might look like or what decolonization might look like, right? That word is just sort of starting to appear. But it's pretty problematic because that's not really what America wanted, as we're going to see kind of in the future. On the flip side, Lenin was popular at the same time. He was writing about communism and Marxism with a particularly strong view of anti-imperialism. And he thought that what had gone wrong with Europe was all of this sort of imperialism and all of these colonial endeavors. And that by taking over other nations, other people, that's how the trouble got started. That's why the world was headed in the wrong direction. And Lenin wanted to abolish all the empires. He said that they shouldn't exist. People should have self-determination. And he was particularly writing about Africa and Asia, because those were the places that Europeans had been most sort of adventurous recently in terms of their imperialism. Now, in the end, what Lenin envisioned was a sort of global Soviet-style socialism. So he said, look, first, he wasn't pro-nation state. In fact, he wanted something else. But he sort of saw it as a scientific process, as a sort of development. Like first you need this, then you need this, then you need this. He said, right now you have all these colonies and you have empires, and those need to transition into individual nation states. And then once you have individual nation states and national consciousness, then you can evolve again into a sort of Soviet-style state, a Soviet-style consciousness. Communists saw themselves as very future-oriented, and they were really hip, actually, into things like science fiction, because it was all about imagining a world in the future that's better based on new technology, based on new philosophy. Now that we have the resources to make enough food for everyone, or now that we have factories that can produce so much, shouldn't we be able to make every human being's life wonderful? So that's where communists are coming from. So he wanted independence for these places, but so that they could ultimately become part of this sort of like global plan. And this was really appealing to a lot of colonized places because the colonies had long heard that the British or the Americans or the French or whoever were racially and religiously and linguistically and ethically superior, and that they were like uplifting the colonies slowly somehow over time. But that wasn't really happening. And what Lenin said was, let's actually do it, right? And even though it was part of like more of a global plan, people were responding to that. They had had enough of the sort of like, oh, British are superior and they'll get around to it when they want. Lenin's call to sort of actually put these things into practice made a lot of sense to people in the colonies. At the same time, one thing that Lenin and Wilson didn't really deal with was this issue of racial equality. And the people who were going to kind of lead the way in the early 19th or in the early 20th century on racial equality was actually Japan, which is kind of interesting. So Japan had, remember we watched that video on the Meiji Restoration, and they had this sort of idea about race that was imported from the United States and Europe, and they were fighting to escape sort of racial prejudices and stuff. There was this whole system of racial hierarchies that had been developed and were allegedly like scientific and stuff coming out of Europe and the United States. So by the 1910 time, Japanese had decided that racially they were basically white, and that they were every bit as good as white people racially. And in fact, they tried to be called honorary whites. And several Japanese actually argued that they were white and that the people who call themselves white were really like translucent or pink or whatever. They were something else. And that it was really the Japanese who should be seen as white, or at least should be considered white for legal purposes. So at the Paris Peace Conference, the Japanese sent a delegation, and they said, look, the war to end all wars, great. We're going to have the League of Nations, great. We're going to solve world problems. In order to make this work, let's put a clause into the League of Nations Charter. Let's put a clause into all of these treaties that say all races are equal, that just say, let's have racial equality. And Britain and France and the United States just reject it out of hand. They absolutely not. And they're worried about what that will mean for their colonies. They're worried about what that will mean for their domestic policies. Remember, segregation in the United States was legal, but not only legal, was required, it was mandated, right? So the United States didn't want a racial equality clause on the sort of international level. It would make them clearly be breaking the law or look like bad folks. The British didn't want it because what would that mean for their empire in India or whatever? So it's rejected. But the Japanese take this really hard. They had thought that the Westerners operated on logic and legal principles, and that if this stuff was all sound and scientific, that it should be easy to show that the Japanese were just as good racially and all this sort of stuff. But their goal is really unclear, because by this time, the Japanese had already colonized Korea, for example, and they were engaging in really harsh programs to basically try to erase Korean identity. Eventually, they were going to make Korean folks all change their names to Japanese names. They were trying to, force the Koreans to learn Japanese and not speak Korean, all these other sorts of things. So it's unclear what exactly Japan's goals were in terms of this meeting. They wanted racial equality for the Japanese, not necessarily for everybody else. So it's interesting. But when they try to do this, yeah, here you go. Here's a nice postcard. So this is a Japanese postcard from the Paris Peace Conference, right? This depiction of Japan trying to bring together all the nations or whatever. When this bill or addendum gets shot down, intellectuals and scholars all over the colonial world see that, and they think, that was kind of our shot. Weren't we supposed to be getting something here? Weren't we fighting for something? Remember, lots of Chinese and Indians and people from Latin America had fought in World War One, and they kind of had like unofficial promises that after the war was over, there would be a better world for them. But this idea of racial equality was very publicly shot down. So what would that better world look like, right? At the same time, there's a very quick backlash to the mandate system. So remember, that was supposed to break up the Ottoman Empire, and it was supposed to help these people become nation states. But people pretty quickly saw it as just another form of imperialism, even though they were talking about, oh, it's not imperialism and these aren't colonies. They're like trusteeships and stuff. People that lived in the Arab world, people that lived in Southwest Asia, immediately were opposed to it. And other nation states, not just in the League of Nations, but intellectuals and thinkers who were looking at this, were opposed to it on the grounds that it was just more colonialism. So places like Korea, China, India, Egypt, they looked at this and they said, this is just the British and the French just grabbing more territory for themselves. And these states felt really betrayed because they had fought in the war. Many of them had fought to help British and French positions in the Mediterranean or in Southwest Asia. They had fought against the Ottoman Empire and they had won. So there were some Arab folks and some Jewish folks that were really hopeful that when the war ended, they would see the results of their effort translate into new statehood for themselves. They would get that independence that Wilson was talking about, but they didn't. Um, so the Republic of Turkey really is the only state to be kind of independent newly out of this, but that's really upsetting for these other people because the Republic of Turkey was kind of the Ottoman Empire, right? They were kind of the bad guys from the perspective of the British and the French, but they get to have their own state and they get to develop their own identity and self-determination, whereas the other places in the region, Lebanon and Jordan and um, some of the Emirates and Iraq, were beholden to the British and the French. So it was really clear that it wasn't working just right from the start. So we're going to see that's going to lead to more problems, definitely in the 20s and 30s, but also after World War II. So with this kind of pushback against imperialism and this rejection of racial equality, there's a weird moment that's happening at the same time that some people have argued is this first sort of twinge of people of color around the world kind of uniting in opposition to imperialism or in opposition to the sort of New World Order, which was focused on British, French, and American sort of superiority and power. So in January 1919, the International League of Darker People is founded. And this is in direct parallel to the League of Nations. So this is founded by Madam C.J. Walker. She's there kind of in the middle left of this photo. If you don't know her, she's a really interesting lady. You should check her out. She is African American and is the first, like multimillionaire. She makes hair and skin products particularly for African American women. And that was like revolutionary and new and kind of crazy. But there's a lot of other people that are in this League of Darker Peoples that are quite famous. Marcus Garvey, Adam Clayton Powell, Senior. Junior's not really on the scene yet, although he's going to be a bigger deal later on. A. Philip Randolph, right? These are like huge names in the early civil rights movement in the U.S. And it's sort of a think tank almost of sort of Pan-African folks from around the United States and the Caribbean and Canada and England. And they're not opposed to the League of Nations or anything like that. They're just arguing, look, there's other interests that we have that are not being met by the League of Nations. At the same time, there's other civil rights activists and Pan-African activists at the Paris Peace Conference. In fact, W.E.B. Du Bois is at the Paris Peace Conference, which is kind of crazy. And he runs a Pan-African conference at the same time, sort of in parallel. So there's all of these world leaders from West Africa, from the Caribbean, from the United States that meet, that are representatives of the Black communities in those nations or locations. And they have their own sort of conference on the future of the world and anti-imperialism and racial equality, and they're discussing all of these issues at the same time that all of the world powers are discussing the end of the war. So really incredible stuff and quite daring. Most of these people get in trouble back home or have some sort of issues with their government, right? They're worried about them going to these sorts of conferences. And they're motivated by that sort of rejection of racial equality coming out of the war. They're motivated by their own civil rights movements in the United States, for example. They're motivated by the underrepresented role of their nations in global politics in West Africa or the Caribbean. And they're all sort of talking to each other and sharing ideas. And this is going to eventually lead to Pan-African movements more broadly, or it's going to lead towards the movements coming out of the Harlem Renaissance and all kinds of stuff like this. So just kind of keep this in your mind. This is like just starting. It's really revolutionary, and we're going to see it kind of play out over the next few decades when we talk about the 1920s and 30s and stuff. So the ending of the war really does change the way the world looks. In particular, it brings down some really big empires, right? So the Austrian-Hungary Empire, the Russian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, right? They're all going to be gone. Um, and in a way, it's going to restructure the British Empire. We'll get to it, but it's really interesting what's going to sort of happen. It's really shaking up um, what the power structures look like in Europe. It's cementing that sort of order of European supremacy, but it also provided a hint to people out in the colonies in the imperial world about alternatives or what could be. Um, and it's going to really increase the power of the United States, right? So, unlike most of the European countries, the United States really doesn't lose anything from World War One. Right? We didn't lose any territory, we didn't lose a ton of money, we didn't get really bombed, but we gain a lot of international prestige and economic power, and Europeans owe us money and all kinds of things like that. So it's pretty good for that. So we'll see the sort of results of World War One are going to really spin out in the first half of the 20th century. So next time, get reading on this chapter for Traditions and Encounters, and we're going to talk about these kind of weird little decades in between World War One and World War Two, where there's lots of new sort of political experimentation. There's a sort of big boom and a bust in the economy. We'll see what that looks like. So let me know if you have any questions. Otherwise, talk to you again soon.